Hi, and welcome to a Kentico Basics video. This series is inspired by my experiences over the past few months with auditing Kentico sites. It really can be surprising to see the steps developers miss when it comes to working with Kentico. Today we'll be exploring Kentico caching, or server-side tricks to speed up your site. I'm your host, Michael Kincaid. You can find me on Twitter at MeAndMyRobot. I'm a Kentico MVP and the CTO at Eccentric Arts Inc., which is a digital agency in Toronto, Canada. So 9 times out of 10, when we get asked to audit Kentico sites, somebody somewhere is pretty frustrated. And they're frustrated because the site they got developed wasn't so much www.awesome.fast as promised, but rather www.painfully.slow. Even with a tricked out front end with compression, minification, optimized images, sites can still be horribly slow, and you guessed it, 9 times out of 10, the smoking gun is found on the server side. But here's the deal. If you're creating a site with Kentico EMS, frankly, there's no excuse for slowness. Seriously. Kentico comes with a huge toolkit of features to make your site run fast. All you have to do is apply them. As you can see, all of these features popping up have the term caching in them, and almost all of them relate in one way or another to reducing the chatter between the website and the database server. As the more database calls you have, the poorer your site performance, especially under load. So what exactly is caching? Here's the unimaginatively named user 1. He visits your Kentico site and sends a request for the About page. Kentico then gets to work on building the page. To do this, it lifts information from the database. Now, in the world of performance, calls to the database should be handled with care. You don't want to get too chatty, as talking to the database is expensive. With the work done, Kentico returns the page. Hopefully you get more than one visitor to your site. Here comes user 2. User 2 asks for the same About page. Kentico then repeats the very same calls to build the page and return it. Surely there has to be a better way than to keep repeating the same work over and over again. And there is caching. Caching is a strategy whereby you save the results of all your hard work into memory or to disk so that you can refer to it when it's next needed, rather than repeating the hard work. So let's run through the scenario again. User 1 requests the page, Kentico chats with the database, but, and this is where caching comes in, before it returns the page, it stores the results of all that hard work in cache. Pretty much anything can be added to cache, from full HTML pages, dataset results, and much, much more. Items in the cache can be configured with settings like an identifier that you can use to refer to the cached item, an expiry date, and dependencies on other objects that, should they change, will expire the item in cache. With the results in cache, the page is sent off to the user. Now, when user 2 requests the page, Kentico won't need to talk to the database, but rather lift what it needs from cache to rebuild the page and return it. For as long as this item is in cache, the same thing applies to user 3, 4, 5, you get the idea. So hopefully 2 questions are coming to mind now. First, how can I easily see the number of SQL calls Kentico is making? And secondly, how can I track what is being added to cache by Kentico or my code? This is the perfect segue, some might say I planned it this way, to our first basic topic, which is debugging. Visual Studio and SQL Server Manager both come with phenomenal debugging tools, and as a developer you should certainly get familiar with these. But did you know that Kentico ships with built-in tools specifically designed to help developers debug their Kentico sites? These are super easy to set up for development. So here I have a blank Kentico 10 installed in localhost. It's a blank site template. There's not much on the master page. Well, there's nothing. And there's also no web parts in the actual homepage template that we've set up. So it really is an empty site. Now, Kentico actually comes with a debug module. So we haven't got anything special configured, but if we just jump into that module, you'll see that we get reports like system objects, cached items, and worker threads. Cached items will show you the items, obviously, that are in cache at the moment, and you can look at a bit more detail. So if we open this one up, you'll see that we're actually caching a JavaScript file that's used frequently by Kentico. There are a lot more settings when it comes to debugging. So if we check out settings within here under system, and then in a debug section, you'll see that we have full configuration over debugging. We can disable debugging, we can set up different debugging values as well on all different areas. The ones that we're interested in, however, are cache access and SQL queries. So we're going to enable cache access debug, and then we're also going to get Kentico to write out the information about cache access on the live site. So it will append this information to the page. We're going to do the same thing with SQL queries. So we'll enable this, and we'll also get it to write out there as well. As I said, there's many other settings when it comes to debugging. You can debug all sorts of things like the view state, security, macros. Just for today, when we're talking about performance and caching, we're just going to be focused on the cache access and the SQL queries. So let's save these values. And with them saved, we can go and check out our live site. So let's run the page. It should be empty. But with our settings configured, you'll see that Kentico is adding in information about the cached items that are being accessed by this request or thread. So you can see we're actually accessing that JavaScript file that we opened up earlier. And we're also logging out the SQL queries that are being called by this request. So again, currently we've got a blank page. So we're requesting at the moment sort of page context information. So in this report, you can look at the actual query. You can get a bit of information about the time it took and the volume of data that's been sent back as well. You can also open up and see the detail on an actual cached object and drill down a bit more in terms of what actually is in there and that's being used by the page. So now if we go in to our debug module, now that we have those settings enabled, we actually get a bit more information. The same information that we were looking at on the page is also being written out to these modules here. So in cache access, we can see the item that was accessed, and likewise SQL queries, we're getting a report per page. So you don't have to have those settings turned on and actually being output to your live page. It's just a bit more in your face. You can still have those settings enabled, but only be accessing the information within this debug module in these specific areas. So if we were to toggle that disable debugging setting, all this debugging information that's currently being written out to the live site would all be turned off. So just this setting here would kill anything underneath it. So we still have these set up and they're configured and they're turned on. As I mentioned before, however, you can use a web config value to do the same thing as that checkbox and disable all the debugging. So if we add in our CMS disable debug and set it to true and then run our site again, even though we have those settings turned on, you'll see that we don't get any debug information written out. So again, within settings, we still have the cache access debug enabled. We still have it set to run out to the live site, but that web config file is overriding the settings that are here. Now, just like you don't want your .NET site showing the yellow screen of death on production, you also want to avoid having these debugging settings enabled on non-development sites. Make sure you turn these settings off. Okay, so let's start adding things into our cache. The first out-of-the-box feature that we're going to look at is caching the page info. The default functionality in Kentico when someone visits an uncached page is for it to cache basic page information. And this includes things like the alias path, the page ID and name, other properties such as metadata, SKU information if the page is a product, and workflow information. And note, when you update a page, say you save it, the page info that is cached will refresh. Kentico makes sure that this information is always the latest. Let's check that our debugging is on. Yep, we've got the cache, we've got our SQL queries which actually relate to page information because we're not caching this yet. So let's go turn this on. So within settings, and then this time rather than going to debug, we're going to go into system and then performance. You'll see that we actually have server-side content caching settings, and these are enabled by default in Kentico. But I just turned them off so that we could actually see what queries relate to things like the page information whenever it's turned off. So let's go actually set this here, this cache page info. We'll set it to 10 minutes and see what that does. So we'll save the value. Now we'll go back to our page and refresh it. Now the first time you refresh it, it's going to go through our queries, and then the second time it should be in cache now, and we can see what's actually in here. So beforehand, we only had one item in our cache, which was our modal dialog.js, but now you'll see that Kentico has not only requested for page information, but actually stored that within the cache. So we've got a few objects in here. Again, they start with page info. So you have page info by URL and page info, and that lets you know that these items in cache relate to page info. So we could also have find these items as well by going into our module within Kentico. So if we check out the debug module, we can see the report under cache access or cache items. We can look at all of the cached items in Kentico at the moment, and we can still find them here. You'll see page info, blank site, /home, and we can look at the properties that are being saved. So again, document properties, node properties, all values which you will find within page information. Let's clear the cache. So now we've got nothing in cache whatsoever. We'll go back, we'll hit the site. Again, we have all our queries. We'll hit it again, and you can see that it's caching the items for this page. Now, page info caching is not going to be enough. It would be if we had a lovely blank site like the one I've got here, but once we start actually building a site and adding features such as web parts, then we are going to want to come up with a strategy to cache that content too. And this is where content caching comes in. Content caching saves data loaded by native components, web parts, widgets. We will get into how to manage your own custom components later. Native includes dedicated data sources that we will soon look at, repeaters and viewers with built-in data sources, and also navigation components like the CSS list menu. So these types of Kentico built web parts. Content caching can be set globally, much in the same way as page info caching, or it can be configured at the component level, at the web part level. You can assign cache dependencies so that content isn't outdated. Say, for example, you have cached article information. You likely want that cached item to refresh if an article is updated. To do this, you can create a dependency between your cached item and the article information. Finally, similar to our page info cache, if our page is updated, for example, saved, then the content cache for a page will be refreshed. Let's go check out the content cache functionality in our very minimal site. Our site currently has no content, so let's go and add some in. We'll do this to our home page. So under home, if we go to the design tab, we can add a web part into the template of this page. So within zone main, we're going to go in and add in a web part. We're going to add in a web part that has a built-in data source so that we can see the effect of the content cache that we're going to turn on. So let's go add in and configure a repeater. So we'll set up things like the web part control ID, we'll give it a title, and then we'll specify where it's going to get its content from. So we actually created a couple of article pages underneath the home page. So let's go and specify the path to look at the home page and underneath that. And then we'll also filter the content to just articles. So here we're going to specify article, CMS article. And then as a best practice, we should only ask for the data that we need. So under columns, we're just going to put in the article name column because that's all we're looking for. And then in terms of how it will display, we'll select a transformation, so simple preview. And then we'll save this and let's see what we get. A very beautiful page. Here we have our article repeater listing out our two articles. Now, if we have a look at our public website, here we have the page before we make a request. We'll request the page. It will go through, run through all of our queries. It'll build up the cache because again, we made a change. We saved that page. And then if we request it again, we'll see what's going on. So here we have our 3 items still in cache, our page info objects, our script file. You can also see that we have a new SQL query. And this is the query that's being called by our repeater to go and fetch the article information. If you have a look at the select statement, you'll see that we've got our article name column. And there's a few other columns that Kentico asks for as well. This query is going to now fire every single time somebody comes to this page. So let's go and configure our content cache so that we can actually start to save this information so that we're only requesting it once. As outlined before, we can do this globally, or we can also do it at the individual component level. Let's do it globally first of all. So to do that, we go into settings, and then you may have noticed this from the last video where we did the page info cache. Underneath system and then performance, we actually have a content cache setting as well. So let's set this to 10 minutes and see what it does whenever we now request the page. So if we go back to our page and we request it, the first time again, we're going to go through the SQL, we're going to build up our caches. If we request it now the second time, you'll notice that that SQL query is gone. And what we now have is a new item in our cache, which is the data that was retrieved by our repeater. So we can also do this at the component level. If we go into pages and then go into our home page, and on the design tab, we're going to configure our article repeater. Within here, we have an area called system settings. So within system settings, you'll see that we actually have caching settings here as well. And again, this is at the individual web part level. We can do things like set the item name for the cached item, and you'll see that then in your list of cached items. We can set the minutes that this item should remain in cache. And we can also go and set things like cache dependencies, and Kentico is using default cache dependencies here. And again, we'll look at this in a bit later in the video, but this is a way in which you can say that the item in cache is dependent on, say, another object. And if that object changes, then this item in cache should be expired and it should be refreshed the next time it's requested. Next up for performance and caching, we have data sources. Data sources is a way of sharing data between web parts that have similar data requirements. So we might have a web part that needs article data and another web part that also needs article data. These will both go out and make SQL calls to get the data that they need. This is where our data source web part comes in. So here we have a special type of web part, which is called a data source web part. And you can see that it also is asking for article data as well. Now, with the data source web part on the page, we can actually point the other two web parts to this data source, and they will get their data from the data source web part. So you can see here that we've got our three web parts, but we only have one SQL call. Let's go check this out in action. Here we have our home page with our one article repeater. Here we have the items in cache. You can see we've got our one CMS data source for the one repeater on our page. Let's go and add in a second repeater. We can do this just by copying this repeater and then pasting it into the zone. And here we have our two repeaters. Now, if we go back to our page and we refresh, run through all the SQL, build the cache items, and then call it again, you'll see that we now have two CMS data sources for both of our repeaters, but we're accessing the same information. So this is where we can go and add in a data source web part, and it can lift the information and provide it to our web parts, our repeater web parts. So here under data sources, there's a variety of different data sources that you can use depending on what web parts are consuming the information. But what we're going to do is just add in a page data source for accessing page information. So you configure this much in the same way as you configured the repeater for the articles. What we're going to do is give it a web part control ID. We can specify the path as well. So as you'll remember from the last time, we have our articles under the home page. So we'll set the path to that. We'll also filter the content to our article, CMS article. And we can also do other things as well, much like a repeater. We can come and set a where condition, or we can go and specify the columns. So we'll do the same thing here with article name. And one thing that we're going to need now is we're going to need to take that web part control ID and use that to configure the relationship between our repeaters and this data source web part. So with the article data source added to the page, we'll come in and we will actually configure the repeater to access its data source using the article data source name. We'll do that for both of our repeaters. So we'll do the same thing here. Come in and set the data source name to the name of our page data source, and we'll save this. Now, whenever we go and we reload the page, we should notice a difference. So again, we have two items in cache. If we go through here, we refresh, you'll see that now we only have our one CMS data source, and this is from our data source web part that's providing the information to our two repeaters. So what about caching in your custom code? your custom web parts, info object and providers, custom global events. Kentico naturally has an API for this. It's recommended when Kentico settings for caching aren't appropriate, so these higher levels of caching. For example, something like application-wide data sources, say you have data that is common to all sessions. Now, it's important to note that data cached via the API won't be refreshed on an update say to a page. It's not by default. If you want to get an update, then you need to make a dependency between this and another object or have values to expire the cache within a certain time frame, but you have to manage it within code. We've tidied up our page a little bit. Let's go and add in a custom web part that we've developed. So we'll just go and select this, and we'll go and add it in. And what you can see here just underneath the custom web part is that we're actually rendering out a few columns of user information. If we have a look at the code of our custom web part, then you can see here that within load user data, we're using the user info provider to get our users, and we're just asking for first name, last name, and username. And then we're just going and putting that data into a grid view just so that we can see it on our page. If we have a look at our page now, we'll go and run it, run through the queries, go and call it again. And now you'll see that we have our cached items on the page. But if you scroll down, you'll also notice that we have our query here that's being called by our custom web part. So you'll see the select statement asking for the first name, last name, and the username. Every time this page calls, we're going to be making that query. So how do we cache it? In our web part, what we're going to do is rather than call load user data, we're going to call this other method that we wrote load user data with cache. And in here, we're going to call Kentico's caching API. So let's go and call this. Now within load user data with cache, you'll notice that what we do first of all is we're actually calling Kentico's API, and it's the cache helper object. Here we're telling Kentico to call load user data, and we're also passing in settings for our cache. For example, that we want this item to last for 20 minutes, and we're also giving it a name for the cached item, which is going to be custom data source bar, and then we're going to make it unique by adding in the client ID. And then we're going to bind that into our grid view. If we actually look at load user data, the method that we're calling within cache helper, you'll see that it makes the call to get the user data. So the way the cache helper works is that it will go looking for the item using the name that we've given it, the custom data source plus the client ID. And if that item exists in cache, it will just return it. If it doesn't exist, then it's going to go and call load user data to retrieve the information from our database. So let's go and we'll build this, and then we'll go and see what this does on our debug. So now this is built. Let's go over and have a look. So we'll refresh the page, and then we'll call it again to see what's happening. So now whenever we call the page again, you'll notice that that query has now gone, and we have an extra data source within our cached items accessed by this request or by this thread. And you'll see that it's the custom data source slash, and then we've got the client ID. So here we have the data. But what if the data changes? We already have this covered by setting the cache dependency here in load user data. You'll see that what we're doing is we're making this cached item dependent on cms.user objects and a change anywhere within cms.user. So if we go over to our site and refresh the page, you'll see that we're still lifting our information from cache. And now, because we have made this dependency on cms.user, if we go into the users module and make a change, so here we'll update the information for Andy, we'll change his username to Andrew, his first name to Andrew, and we'll save that. Now that we've made a change on cms.user, and because we have that dependency between our cached item and this object, we go back to the page and we request the page again, Kentico is actually going to go and make a SQL call to get updated information because it's aware of the relationship between the cached item and the dependent object changing. And then if we go and call the page again, what you'll see is that that query will go away because now we're lifting things from cache. Again, this is all due to the cms.user / all dependency we have. If you want to know more about this sort of format and about how to create dependencies between different types of objects in Kentico, then check out the documentation. This will provide you with all the information you need to make your own dependencies between objects and items in cache. As we say in Northern Ireland, output caching is the daddy. This form of caching is the most effective way to boost performance. The output cache stores the full HTML source code of a page. Until the cache expires, Kentico displays this page using the cached output. Now, it does make variations based on some contextual information, such as the client who's making the request or user, and you can configure these. Kentico recommend using output caching for all the pages that you can get away with using it on, especially when there is a chance of high load on individual pages. The drawback is that cached output can become outdated on dynamic pages or if the website's content is updated. So easy targets for this type of caching are pages that don't change often, for example, privacy policy, about us. But basically the go-to should be see if you can stick this on, and if you can't, then go down to a lower level of caching. As you may have guessed, output cache is configured within system and then performance. Now it's enabled by default in the system-wide settings. So you can see here, enable output caching is on. However, because this is configured at the individual page level, it's important to remember that you have to opt into this setting within the content tree. So if we have a look here at the root node, go under General, at the bottom of the page, you'll see that we have configuration settings for output cache for this page. So we can set this page to 10 minutes. Now the value is inherited throughout the content tree so that you don't have to set it everywhere. But if you pick an individual page, you can opt out of output caching or opt in and configure the settings for that individual page. So we might change the cache minutes, for example. If it's set, we'll save the page and then we'll go back to the live site and see what happens. So here we have our page again with our repeater and our table. If we refresh it, you'll see that there's no debug information, there's no SQL calls because this is now being lifted from output cache. Now the downside obviously here is that if information changes, that it won't be until that output cache expires that the user sees it. So for example, if we go to our user information and we update Andy, so we change his username to Andy, change his first name to Andy, and then save this and go back to the live site, we'll not actually see this update because the output cache hasn't actually expired. So we're still seeing Andrew for the values. That being said, this is a great form of caching on those pages that you can actually use it on. For those pages that you can't, we can use something called partial caching. Given you can't always use output caching, Kentico has a really neat feature called partial caching. This lets you turn on HTML caching at the component level. So say you've got a page and it has a web part that's quite happy with output caching. This guy here, no worries, he can handle output caching. But this web part, it's maybe different per user, or it's just very dynamic, and caching this in terms of output caching is just going to be weird. Say it renders out someone's name. If you can't use output caching, then this should be the next approach you look into for optimizing performance. Back on our site, I've disabled output caching and I've removed the repeater web part. So now we only have our custom web part on our home page. I've also removed the API caching that we had in our custom web part. So now if we go over and have a look at the live site and run the page, we'll see that although we're caching things like the page info, our custom web part is making that SQL call each and every time that we request the page. So this is where partial caching can come in if we can't turn on output caching. What we can do is we can go into the web part and go down to performance and actually set partial caching settings for this particular web part. So we can give it a set time for the cache. Let's save this and go back to our page. Now whenever we request the page, what we'll see is that that SQL call is no longer being made. And you can see that we have a partial cache item in here with an identifier based on the ID of that web part. Now, the unfortunate thing here is that, again, if we go into our users module and we update the, say, a particular user and change their information, let's pick on Andy again. So we'll go and we'll change his username and his first name back to Andrew. When we save this information, we're not going to see it being updated or reflected on our live site. So if we refresh the page, we'll see we still have Andy. So what we can do to get around this is similar to our custom code. Within Pages, when we configure our partial cache for this web part, We can also give it a dependency. So if we go to home and edit our web part, we can tell the custom web part that it's going to be dependent, or its cached item will be dependent on any change within CMS users. So here for partial cache dependencies, we can go in and say CMS user all. Now, whenever we go and make a change into users, we should see that reflected. So let's just refresh our page. This time we'll get the change we made with Andy. And now let's go over to users and actually create a new update. So we'll go and pick on Andy for one last time. Let's totally change his identity. We'll go and rename him to Peter. So change the username, and we'll change the first name. And now, unlike the last time, now that we have that cache dependency on CMS user, when we refresh the page, we'll see that, yep, we're now getting Peter stored as the first name and the username. In summary, there's no excuse for poor performance. You should develop a caching strategy using the myriad of Kentico options. Apply high-level caching when you can, so that's output caching for full page HTML, or partial caching for component HTML or web part HTML, and go lower level when it's required, e.g. using the API caching with Cache Helper. Finally, make sure you monitor your SQL and cache usage while you develop. Don't wait until the end. It's going to cost you more time to actually be able to find out what it is that's causing the problems. Do it as you're developing. Cheers.